Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for being here. We've got a great program for you today. And in addition to thanking everybody for being here, I want to thank also many of you who joined on this call, who joined us last week for the program that we did on gun violence prevention and school safety and intervention. For that program, we brought in Sandy Hooks, Promise Director for the Northeast, the Director of Counseling and Behavioral Health for the Medford Public Schools, Massachusetts high school student who is a member of the Sandy Hook Promise National Youth Advisory Board, and Special Agent from the FBI, Sarah Wielden, who is the threat assessment. And we talked about gun violence and in particular how it appears in school settings. We had over 150 people join us on that call, and I think it spoke really to two things: the very real fear that people have about their kids when they go off to school, whether it's in a high school setting or a college setting, and also coupled with that, the desire to really make a difference and what can we be doing. So I hope if you joined us, you found the program useful and also very concrete in terms of both the Sandy Hook Promise steps that they talked about that you can be taking and the things that Sarah talked about in terms of threat assessment. If you missed the program and want to see it, we've posted the recording on our YouTube channel, and the resources that came from the FBI and from Sandy Hook Promise are on our website. So we'll share all of that in the chat. Now, before we get to our speakers today, I want to begin, as we always do, by looking at the numbers. And again, knowing always that the loss of one life is too many. We do have a little bit of good news to share today. Since our last meeting on February the 8th, we have had 12 additional accidental overdoses that our troopers have responded to. They are, as you would expect, again, scattered across the county, with the exception of Cambridge, which had 2, every other town had only 1. What we know so far from those cases where we have already gotten back a report from the medical examiner is that 2 were fentanyl and 3 were pills. And as we like to do, to give you a little bit more personal sense of that, those 12 people that lost their lives, we know that one was a young man in his early 30s who had, according to everybody who knew him, not been using for over a year, had been in recovery for over a year. His wife went away on a trip, was concerned when she couldn't reach her husband, thought that he might have started using again while she was gone, had a friend go to the house, and he was found in his bed. Similarly, we had the same age woman, a woman in her early 30s, leave the family home, go to a hotel when family hadn't heard from her for a little bit, and they asked the hotel to check, also found deceased in her bed. And again, sort of corresponding, a man and a woman in their mid-50s. With the man, he didn't show up for work on a Friday morning. Friends went out to the house and located him in the house. Woman, the same thing. She didn't show up for work. Her boss went out to the house and found her deceased. She was one of the individuals who we now know the cause of death was a fentanyl overdose. So, you know, just keeping in mind the commonality of these across so many demographics, but, you know, they're being located by somebody who knows them, a spouse, a boss, a coworker, who are either going themselves or making that well-being call. And that to me just reaffirms what we have talked about so often is, as tragic as it is to lose a life, it isn't just that individual. It's that circle of that person's family and close friends who are impacted by that. Now, the good news piece is that taking this period of time to the same period of time last year, we are down by 25% in terms of the numbers. And when you take that number of people that did not suffer an overdose and multiply that, even if we're giving everybody 10 people who are connected to them, it's a pretty big number of people who aren't experiencing that loss. When we look from January 1st until now, we see that we are down by 16 deaths from where we were last year. So again, some reason for optimism, but a reminder just of the continuing need for work and vigilance in this area. So today I want to talk about our three presenters who are here with us. Erin Miller and Tanisha Arena join us from Growing a New Heart organization, and they're going to talk to us about the intersection of sexual and domestic violence and substance use. And they have a project that's being sponsored by the Bureau of Substance Abuse Services, and they're going to give us an overview of that. And Dr. Sharon Levy is the director of the Adolescent Substance Use and Addiction Program at Boston Children's Hospital. She's an associate professor of pediatrics at Harvard Medical School. And Dr. Levy is going to talk to us about adolescent development and the impact of substance use on the developing brain, and talk about the ASAP program that she leads and her research on adolescent screening. And that's particularly timely because we're going into, despite the snow, sort of that spring and prom and graduation season. And we started last night the programs that we do around the county with kids and their parents, usually the juniors and the seniors in high school and their parents. The schools make it a requirement that they have this program about social host liability and substances before they can go to the prom. And just talking to parents about kids' brain development, both in terms of how impulsive they are and then how substances are often involved in these events. So we're going to start with Erin and Tanisha. And as I said, Erin, who's an old friend of the office, is an intersectional activist working in partnership with Black women, immigrant Latin, Haredi, who are fervently Orthodox Jewish women in the LGBTQ community. She is a specialist in the areas of trauma, abuse, and substance use disorders. And most recently, she served as the Equity, Inclusion, and Abuse Prevention Officer at Newton Wellesley Hospital. We've known Erin so long that she was the originally started so many of the domestic violence programs at Newton Wellesley, which really sort of set the bar for a lot of the work in this area. Erin also has the privilege of sitting on the project management team for the National Telenursing Center, and she's currently the Chief Transformational Officer at the Center for Safety and Change in Rockland County, New York. She holds degrees in Black Studies and gender-based violence, as well as credentials in substance use counseling and trauma. She is presently a Bloomberg Fellow at Johns Hopkins School of Public Health, where she's working towards her MPH. And she's been working on the intersection of sexual and domestic violence and substance use disorder as part of that project that I mentioned. Tanisha Arena is a Black woman in community leadership as the executive director of Arise for Social Justice in Springfield. She holds a master's in nonprofit management from Bay Path University, and she's an experienced educator at Growing a New Heart, where she trains regularly on topics such as dialogues across differences, compassionate, accountable conversations, undoing white supremacy, and holding space for a wide range of social justice and community-based organizations. Ms. Arena has deep roots in the field of anti-violence work, specializing in community advocacy and a response to intimate partner violence within the LGBTQIA community. She is a published author whose current projects include an award-winning podcast called Unapologetic, where she talks about current racial activism and politics in a way that explores those racial realities with courage, clarity, and humor. And she's been working at that same intersection of sexual and domestic violence and substance abuse as part of the project with Erin. So I'm delighted to have them here and to turn it over to both of you. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Erin, she, her, hers. It's lovely to be back. I used to participate in this space about 100 years ago when Sean McMaster was still part of the office. So thank you for the excuse to join all of you. And I think my colleague Tanisha has the PowerPoint. Yes. So Tanisha and I are both consultants for Growing a New Heart, which has a large project at the moment with the Bureau of Substance Addiction Services. And Tanisha is going to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so we've been doing this project. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. And we've been doing this, and there's the intersection of substance use and intimate partner violence, and the tensions and the alignments in the work of substance use recovery and interrupting intimate partner violence. This work, let me see if I can get this share to happen as we want it to. Yay. Okay. So there were a team of folks. I love it when the technology works. Thank you. Thank you. 9 months, folks worked together. The DPH awarded CDC grant cooperative agreement for emergency response. And there were lots of content experts, some names you might recognize here. And it's coming together at this intersection to do this. And it's important that you know that there were 2 divisions for the Department of Public Health that have been working on this for about 7 years, on this intersection of substance use and sexual and domestic violence. And Growing a New Heart is currently working on a project that involves training, leadership learning collaboratives, technical assistance, and piloting new integrated service models. And we will have free resources to share with you at the end. So let's see if we can also get this going. Here we go. Erin.
Chapter 209A, very familiar, I imagine, to most of you, right? Mass General Law. Under 209A, imminent harm or threat of imminent harm, generally focused on physical and sexual harm. And yet we are in Massachusetts, which is delightful because it allows us to focus more broadly. Most of you are already aware that most forms of coercion, intimidation, abuse are legal. And that physical and sexual violence are the thing that abusive people resort to when all else has failed. So thankfully in Massachusetts, we embrace the legal definition, and we also utilize definitions that are much more expansive, much broader. And we look not only to the pattern of different kinds of tactics that someone engaging in harm might use, we also look to the context and to their underlying values. And indeed, this is the critical heart of our project with BSAS, focusing on those underlying abusive values and how we can help people to engage in a change process.
Okay. So why are people abusive? I'm going to give you the short version, right? And we've identified 8 basic underlying beliefs or values that are present when someone exhibits domination in relationships. The first one is about misusing your power. Right? When you feel uncomfortable, you've done something that I don't like it, so therefore I can do X, Y, Z. And I mean anything from physical discomfort of dehydration, emotional discomfort, as in you just don't like it, right? So I also mean unresolved trauma. So the research is showing that in order to be violent, you need to believe it's okay to be violent under certain circumstances and that you have social support for it, right? This violence is palatable. Yeah, no big deal. Hurt people don't hurt people. Hurt people hurt. Hurt people with untransformed abusive values hurt people. The second abusive value is one of superiority. Sometimes it's gender superiority. Sometimes you've assigned your partner a lesser role. So the first and second value will work together. You can be uncomfortable with what your boss said, but be skillful enough and safe all day and wait until you get home and then punish your partner to whom you have assigned an inferior role. And these abusive values, the rest of them are about a lack of mutual accountability, right? So believe I can hurt you or intimidate you or misuse my power to show contempt if I feel uncomfortable. You shouldn't have made me feel that way. Number two, believing I'm inherently superior. That makes males, white people superior. I'm better than you because I'm straight. I'm better than you because I'm cisgender. I believe that it is your job to accept me no matter what I do. You knew what it was when we got together. I believe that I have the right to tear you down if you point out something about me that threatens my self-concept. Oh, so you're perfect? Believe that you must celebrate me, my self-perceived strengths, my growth and change, and not mention how very little I've changed. All that was in the past. It's over. I'm doing great. Nothing I ever do is good enough for you. Maybe you've heard some of these in your spheres, at home, at work, because they're always around us. I believe that I can act disgusted and insulted and insulting if you point out significant things that I forget or do not know. What the hell do you know about that anyway? Believing that I can establish reality, fact patterns to my liking. No, that never happened. I never said that. You're crazy. The gaslighting, it's very real. Believing that I can be contemptuous or violent if you complain because I should never be answerable to you. I don't answer to you. What did you say? Shut your mouth if you know what's good for you. These abusive values are always at play in everything that we do in all of the spaces.
Lots of times when I am training fellow addictions counselors, they have questions about emotion regulation, right? Aren't people who engage in harm, who use harms against other people, aren't they truly just lacking skills? Don't they need some skill to be able to self-regulate better? We actually have a deeply different interpretation. So does the research. Tanisha, can you move to the next slide?
There you go.
The truth is that substances don't cause people to be abusive. They may aggravate the situation. They may amplify or reveal someone's underlying abusive value system, but substance use does not cause abuse. I want to give you an example. Dan Ellis runs an IPEAP, not in Massachusetts at the moment, but Dan used to run a group specifically for men who engaged in harm against their partner. It was a dual group, men who had engaged in harm and who had substance use challenges. And Dan always used to use this fabulous exercise where he would empathize with the men in the group and say, you know, I know it is profoundly difficult. Adulthood is difficult. And, you know, when you are using, you know, did you steal stuff when you were under the influence? And a lot of men in the group would be like, yeah, I did. I did because I was using. And then he'd say, and of course, you know, there were times when you were drunk and you'd hit your partner as a result. And the men in the group would agree and agree heartily. And then Dan would say, and of course, there was the times when you sexually assaulted your grandmother when you were under the influence, which of course would stop the group cold. Right? What? Wait, no, what? No, that's disgusting. I would never sexually assault my grandmother. And so Dan would say, really, tell me why. And well, I would just never do that. I would never sexually assault my grandmother. And Dan would point out to them the obvious, that they still have control. That if their value system says to them, under no circumstances should you have sex with your grandmother or rape your grandmother, then it doesn't matter how drunk or how high you are, you're not going to assault your grandmother. So the difference here is not what substances you're taking or how much of those substances you're taking. The root is, do you believe you are entitled to exercise those behaviors? Indeed, the folks at Emerge, the IPEAP for Middlesex County, often talk about the fact that in group, men will say, well, I knew I was going to get into it with my partner, my girlfriend, my wife, my significant other. So I stopped at the bar on the way home. I stopped at the liquor store because I wanted to have an excuse when her brother intervened, when our son tried to get in the middle and stop my behavior, when the police showed up. Abusive people grow up in the same communities and cultures that we all do, and they've grown up with the same myths and stereotypes around substance use, and they work very hard. They're actually deeply skillful at manipulating those stereotypes. The truth is that substance use is not a root cause in the vast majority of cases of violence and abuse. What it does is amplify someone's abusive value system and make it more readily visible and transparent to all the rest of us.
Absolutely. Like we say when we do our larger training, we'll talk about here, Massachusetts has dispensaries. There's no misogyny in the gummies. There's no racism in the gummies. There's no abuse in the gummies because it doesn't make you abusive. It just simply uncovers what's already there. So let me get on to our next slide here. And this is the tensions in the framework and the intersection of substance use disorder and sexual and domestic violence. So if we go back and forth,
I'm sorry, Keisha. I was going to say we work very hard, don't we, on the substance use disorder side to push for decriminalization, right? To remove stigma, to say this is something we should have an open and transparent public health conversation about.
And then on the SDV side, survivors have worked for years to get what happened to them to be recognized as crime. Something has happened to me. And only in our field, there's a great deal of movement to turn towards restorative practices instead of criminal legal interventions. And we haven't resolved this.
On the medical side, the medicine, and I say this as someone who spent 15 years at Mass General Brigham, medicine has a large voice here, right? Many of us embrace a disease model of addiction, brain disease, right? This is a brain hunger. And that does a lot of work to remove that stigma. If this is a disease, someone deserves treatment, they deserve support. This is not a character flaw or a moral failing.
And I want to go back to the SDV side with the decriminalization. With this practice, with the unresolved tensions, when the judges are faced with a person who has strangled their partner while they were high, they'll get sentenced to treatment, believing that the violence will end for the person in recovery, but that's a mistaken idea, as we just talked about with the Dan Ellis teaching story. So taking that going forward with the substance use about understanding addiction, we look at the underlying values that cause the violence. Someone in recovery will believe that their violence is just part of their disease, but it's not. It's really not.
Harm reduction, fentanyl test strips, Narcan, clean needles, safe use injection sites. This is the cutting edge of addictions work, and it saves lives.
And on the sexual domestic violence side, we can't say that it's okay to strangle your partner fewer times this week. Good job. We need to have a zero tolerance. However, part of what we do is harm reduction. Sometimes a goal for change is for the abusive person to become safe enough to be left. Like, you're uncomfortable that I want to go, but you're not going to strangle me on my way out.
Destigmatization. In substance use work, we foundationally, right, it's a core principle that we are working to relieve people of shame. Shame is something that moves people out of sobriety, keeps them from seeking help, it keeps them from seeking support. We have worked since the beginning of the addictions movement to say there should be no stigma here. You should have no shame. This is like cancer or diabetes or asthma. You deserve treatment.
And on the sexual domestic violence side, that means, though, when people who use violence are in recovery, they get upset that they are being held in compassionate accountability. They say, don't shame me. There is a difference between reintegrative shame, which is building a conscience, and toxic shame, which says you're a bad person. So we need to make the distinction about that.
Powerlessness over your disease. Again, a core principle of substance use work. We ask people to admit that they are powerless in the face of their addiction.
And then the power and control on the SDV side. Survivors of sexual and domestic violence do not feel relief at using this term because they have been so harmed by the powerlessness they have experienced at the hands of their abuser. They need to feel their agency.
Internal individual focus. We do a lot of one-on-one work or even group work in substance use disorders, but we rarely talk about the structural roots of addiction. Oh, excuse me, I skipped one. It's the one place where these two fields actually are significantly in alignment, which is we understand self-centeredness when we see it, right? Here's a place where both substance use disorder work and sexual and domestic violence work, we understand the person who is engaging in harm, the person who is using, to be solipsistic in a way that is not constructive or useful for change. Right. And on the substance use side, we have a deeply individual focus. It's a white Western focus on this person. You are broken. We can fix you without attendance to the structural causes of someone's substance use.
Right, which those are not broken. They're operating as intended. So on the SDV side, we're looking at the interpersonal context and the cultural context. And that's where our work is. It's on the interpersonal and cultural level, right? We cannot just strip away that context when we're looking to meet at the intersections and do work to change this.
And I will say, good folks who are the cutting edge of substance use disorder work understand this and are pushing this learning curve throughout the discipline, understanding the structural causes of addiction. Accountability, right? That's what we ask. We ask people to be responsible for their own change, responsible for their own healing in substance use disorder work.
Right. And then on the SDV side, we also use these approaches, right? Social media messaging and what's being accepted and normalized and challenging that. And we are actually seeing change.
Social norms. The substance use disorder field has had enormous success, everything from cigarettes to responsible and moderate drinking, right? Even liquor companies now feel compelled to say drink in moderation. So we've had enormous success in terms of shifting cultural norms when it comes to use of alcohol, nicotine, other substances.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, the socialization to violence and these things aren't okay. That's what's sitting on the SDV side. Yeah. And what we also do, we add the lens of accountability. Who is causing the trauma and how do we stop that?
Yes. Both fields are deeply invested in trauma-informed, trauma-responsive care. But the question we ask on the SDV side that we don't on the substance use disorder side is whose trauma? Whose trauma matters, right? You all know that the first and most important principle of trauma responsive practice is safety for all involved, the program participant, the providers, and the community. And so obviously on the anti-violence side, that is our first priority. That's the place where we're going to focus and work really hard.
Absolutely. Yep. The trauma-informed lens, the accountability to abusive values in oneself and in our culture. So that's pretty much the tensions that exist in our framework at this intersection. And last, here is a resource. There's the Call for Change helpline, and it is anonymous. It is free. It is for folks who cause harm. Like for that person who's like, I knew I was going to get into it. I'm stopping at the bar. This could be a call that they make. I know that I'm about to go home and be abusive to my partner, and I don't want to be that person. You can call this number and actually get an intervention. And it's like, where do you want to be in the next 5 minutes, in the next 30 minutes? Do you want it to be in the back of a cop car? Do you want to become that safer partner? This is a space where folks who know that they are abusive and they want to change, it's a call for that change. And
the helpline is also available to providers, Tanisha, right?
Yes, providers, yes. You can call, get that technical assistance like, hey, I've got this going on. What are your thoughts? And that's also an important resource. And it does not involve calling in the police. which is I wouldn't necessarily make that phone call, I'm not calling. And that's something, again, that cultural context. Here is a Black woman. I just wanted him to stop beating on me, but I'm not calling the cops because they're going to come and they might kill him. It's not what I want. So here's an option.
And many of you who work in criminal legal circles, I know for me, working at Newton Wellesley Hospital, Newton had a substance use social worker in the police department precisely because the officers were not looking to criminalize people who they understood were struggling, right? Struggling to get into treatment. So again, our public health approach in Massachusetts being a gift, and this being an expansion of the public health tools that are available to all of us.
Right. And also not just in Massachusetts. We started out as the 10 to 10 hotline because that was the hours, but then there were calls outside of the time zone. And this could one day be a national program. So we encourage you to, share this as a resource. And
so, Marian, I'm not sure how much time we have left, but we're happy to take questions about any or all of this. Thoughts?
That would be great. Questions for Tanisha, Erin? You can put them in the chat. You can raise your real hand, raise your electronic hand. Somebody has a question about whether they can get copies of the slides.
I imagine so. I'd want to double check with Jack, who's our fearless leader, but I expect so. And we can email them to the DA's office. Yeah.
Other questions?
Carol.
Yes, hi. I just want to say thank you. I didn't know this program existed. I work in the Needham Public Health Department. I may be a little delayed in my internet, forgive me. And I work with 4 towns, Dedham, Walpole, Westwood, through a BSAS funded grant. And I just thank you. And I took your names and put it in my contact list. And I really appreciate hearing about your program. And as always, DA Ryan brings us things that educate us, even though I learn something new every time. Thank you.
That's the goal. Other questions, comments? All right. Hearing none. Thank you both. Thank you both so very much. That was a great program. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Of course. And now turning to Dr. Levy, who, as I told you, is the director of the Adolescent Substance Use and Addiction Program called ASAP at Boston Children's. Dr. Levy spent the past 20 years evaluating and treating thousands of adolescents with substance use disorder. She's written extensively on the subject. In 2016, she established the nation's first accredited pediatric addiction medicine fellowship training program at Children's Hospital. She is also the past chair of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Substance Use and Prevention, the past president of the Association for Multidisciplinary Education and Research in Substance Use and Addiction. She serves on the board of directors of the American College of Academic Addiction Medicine. And she's conducted research to develop test tools for identifying and addressing adolescent substance use disorders in general medical settings. She has expertise in the integration of substance use treatment services into pediatric primary care. And one of the things many of you have been here over time have heard, we've talked so often about how important the pediatrician's office can be. Kids, especially younger kids, pretty much go regularly to their pediatrician, and that pediatrician can be an important source of having those conversations and raising the issue of substance use or disorders. So, Dr. Levy, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the nice introduction. And before anybody gets too impressed, I did write that. So, I just want to confirm that everybody can see the slides.
Good.
Okay, terrific. So, and before I get started, I just do want to disclose that I've served as an expert witness in the litigation against Juul and on some cannabis litigation. And so with that, today I want to talk to you about adolescent brain development and the cross-section with substance use. And I'm showing you really very old slide. This was published in 1978. So really some time has passed. But what's really, I'm pointing out, this is on the y-axis, we see brain weight. On the x-axis, we see age. And I've highlighted age 10 to 12 because at that point, the brain actually reaches its full weight. And so from the outside, the brain of a 12-year-old is indistinguishable from an adult brain. And really for most of human history, and that's until about 150 years ago, people were considered adults by age 13 or so. Now, I'm going to tell you that I find that fact astonishing because I live with a 15-year-old, and I can tell you that he and his friends are very different from the adults that I know. And I think that it's obvious even on quick glance that there's something very different going on there. So now we understand that in fact, brain development continues until the mid-20s. And I'm showing you some slides that give us some insights into what's happening in brain development. So on the left, you're looking at a slide of brain tissue that was taken at birth. And you can see that there are few cells and few connections. There's lots of room for growth. That's what most of us would probably expect. In the middle, I'm showing you the next stage of brain development that we sometimes call blossoming. And what you're seeing here is that the neurons have become a dense tangle of tissue. So there's been so there have been more cells, and also the connections between cells have just grown at an enormous rate to give you this very, very dense black forest there. And then on the right, I'm showing you the final stage of development, which is actually pruning. So here we go from the stage of development takes us from more brain to less brain. And that seems a little bit confusing. But really what's happened is that the unused connections that have blossomed actually get pruned away. The ones that remain get larger, and then they get wrapped with this fatty insulating tissue that we call myelin. And so these changes together really speed the rate of electrical signal conduction. So the middle picture is showing you a child's brain that's really completely configured to optimally learn new things. It's got all of these potential connections. It's like a sponge, can grab new information, new skills, and use them right away. And so young children are really spectacular at learning things like speaking a language or playing an instrument. But actually, for proficiency, we need our brain to be configured a little bit differently. And so, that's really what the difference is. The older brain is more configured for proficiency. Now, these stages always happen in the same order, but they actually happen in different times in different parts of the brain. And here I'm showing you, again, a little bit of an old slide that is looking at the myelination in the brain. So the parts of the brain that are blue are fully myelinated, meaning they've gone through, they've blossomed, they've been pruned away, and they've been wrapped in myelinated myelin. And that's what we're seeing when it looks blue. When it looks green or red or another color, it means we're on the way, but we're really not there yet to a fully myelinated state. And so you can see that that generally speaking, the brain matures from the back to the front. And another thing that I like to point out is that this graph stops at about age 20. And if you look at this particularly in profile, what you see is that there's still plenty of green in the 20-year-old brain. And this process is thought to be completed somewhere around the mid-20s for most people. Now, it turns out that brain maturation correlates with the behaviors that we expect to see of children at different ages, or really these brain changes are associated with what we call the developmental stages. So for example, in the first year or two of life, the cerebellum, which is way in the back of the brain and controls gross motor movements, is developing rapidly. Now, this is just at the time when young children are beginning to walk, right? And so anyone who's been around a child this age knows that they're completely invested in getting up and walking, and that walking is creating the practice necessary for the feedback loop that is going to result in more brain development and ultimately like a fully myelinated, mature, and completely developed cerebellum in association with a proficient walker. And this drive to walk, of course, is so intense that we call this developmental stage toddlers, right? Because that's what they want to spend their time doing. So in the preschool years, the amygdala, which is an important part of the brain involved in emotional regulation, is developing rapidly. And during this stage of life, which we sometimes refer to as the terrible twos, that's a technical term. We call it that though because kids have these temper tantrums. They seem to come out of nowhere. The adults in the room don't really understand what provoked it, and then they actually disappear. Just same way they came, leaves those who are onlooking sort of confused. That's actually this part of the brain being kind of trigger happy as it's developing, and so there's the emotional regulation is developing, and kids are not completely controlling it, and so we see these huge swings. And by the way, this should be coming to an end by the end of the preschool period, right? And that's why we have kids enter kindergarten around age 5, because that's when this developmental phase is coming to an end, and that's when it's going to be much more feasible to have a group of kids kind of sitting at desks and starting to do pre-academic skills, right? Because we've kind of gotten through the bulk of this phase of development. So in the preschool years, a part of the brain that's developing very rapidly is called the nucleus accumbens. And this is a time in life when kids are becoming self-directed. They're starting to differentiate between important rewards and less important rewards and really develop goal-directed behavior. And I'm going to talk about that more in just a minute. And then the last part of the brain is to develop is the prefrontal cortex, and that is the seat of executive functions, right? And that's executive functions are the things that we need to help us make good decisions, skills like self-monitoring, error correction, impulse control. So I want to be really clear, adolescents, of course, can make good decisions, but during this phase when the prefrontal cortexes are developing, they're not reliably making good decisions. They're more prone to acting impulsively or doing other things, making bad decisions. So in this model, we can describe adolescence as the period after the nucleus accumbens, right? So that's that reward system that we can think of as like the gas pedal of behavior, that's fully developed. But the prefrontal cortex, or, kind of the behavioral brakes, those executive functions, they're still maturing. Okay, and so that really accounts for the typical behaviors we see in the adolescent age group, right? Things like risk-taking and impulsivity. Now, dopamine is the chemical that stimulates brain reward. And in fact, dopamine receptors are at their densest during adolescence, right? So adolescents are really completely prone to doing things that are going to generate a lot of brain reward, right? Because that not only is that nucleus accumbens, it's mature, it's proficient, and it's densely packed with dopamine receptors, but also the behavioral brakes are not yet completely online. And so, as a package, this normal neurodevelopment makes teens curious, makes them impulsive, and frankly, it makes them overconfident. So it means that teens in general have a strong drive for stimulation or brain reward, and they're willing to take place in high-risk activities to get it. So this slide is showing us that adolescents' brains respond differently to rewards compared to both younger children and adults, as this slide demonstrates. So this is a study in which subjects' brains were scanned as they were receiving either a small reward or a large reward. And what we're looking at in the gray bar is the neurologic response in that nucleus accumbens, that reward center. And if you look at the blue bar, you're seeing young children. If you look at the blue bar in this gray stripe, what you see is regardless of whether children got a small reward or a large reward, it didn't really matter. Their brain's reward center fired quite a lot, right? And this is why pediatricians give out stickers in the office and not big prizes, because to a young child, a sticker is like actually very rewarding. Now, if you look at adults, they're in green, and if you look at what you'll see is that you get a proportional response. So small reward, small response in the brain, big reward, bigger response in the brain. So adults are sort of what we might predict. But now let's look at adolescents, and they're in black. And what you see is that when they receive a small reward, their brain actually deactivates below baseline firing. So they're actually like actively kind of displeased by receiving a small reward. And by the same token, this is why we don't give adolescents stickers, right? Because, you know, when you do that, you get some form of an eye roll, right? I mean, they're not really like pleased with that. Now, look over here at the large rewards and look at that black line. And what you're seeing is adolescents actually make this tremendously big response, much bigger than either younger children or older adults when they get a large reward, right? So they're actively going to be seeking things that are largely rewarding. And that basically is the problem with substances. So this is a slide from NIDA, and it's just reminding us that the way that all substances, all psychoactive substances feel pleasurable is through this final common pathway that really directly stimulates dopamine release in the nucleus accumbens. So really, in a way, substances are hijacking the normal reward pathway, right? It's going through all of the normal switches. It's just overriding all of that. And they're going directly to the brain, and they're binding to receptors in the brain that are releasing dopamine in the nucleus accumbens. And now, while substance use is neither natural nor healthy, it does fulfill this developmental drive for adolescents. If your brain is wired to look for things that will release a lot of dopamine, substances are going to be a great shortcut. And this is why adolescents are developmentally vulnerable to substances. And if, as a society, we make them available, we can be pretty sure that adolescents and young adults are the segment of the population that's going to want to use them. And that is confirmed by empiric data. This is data from SAMHSA, and it demonstrates that the peak ages for substance use initiation are between 14 and 20. And you can see that by age 26, substance use initiation is extremely rare. So people really who don't start using a drug in their teens or early adulthood are pretty unlikely to ever start using. So this all is a big deal for kids, right? So they're impulsive, they're looking for brain reward, and they're particularly susceptible to, they're going to be intrigued by substance use. Now, what's happened over the past few years, and I think a lot of people on this task force are aware, is that counterfeit pills with fentanyl in them have started flooding the market. And so the sporadic drug use that we can expect in teenagers has become exceptionally dangerous. And what we're looking at here is the rates of overdose. It's the year-to-year change in the rates of overdose, okay? In blue, you're seeing adolescents, and in yellow, you're seeing the entire population. And basically from what you're seeing in 2019, 2020, and 21 is that those blue bars are bigger for teenagers than they are for the rest of the population. So in other words, the rate of lethal overdose is increasing faster for adolescents than it is for adults, okay? Now in absolute numbers, the adolescents still make a much smaller contribution, but this age group is actually catching up because their rates are increasing so quickly. Now, this is a brief case vignette from the Adolescent Substance Use and Addiction Program, with the outpatient program for teens where I work. So I recently took care of a young woman who was a very high functioning A student. She came to ASAP at the request of her parents for management of a cannabis use disorder. She had been completely abstinent for 2 months after starting treatment. She was doing really well. And suddenly, a random drug test that was collected at home came back positive for fentanyl. She later told her parents that she had tried candy with her friends. And actually, stories like this one happen nearly every week among the young people in our care, right? That suddenly somebody with no opioid use disorder, with no history of opioid use, just normal and often, really frankly, high functioning adolescents going about their daily lives are suddenly exposed to fentanyl. Now, going back to the issue of adolescence and substance use, I've spent a couple of slides showing you that substance use is really dangerous in this age group, even, and we're seeing all kinds of problems, including fentanyl exposure and opioid overdose among kids who don't have a substance use disorder. But there's another problem too, and that is that not only are teens susceptible to trying substances because of their state of neurodevelopment, but they're also very vulnerable to developing substance use disorders. And so back at this slide that shows the hijacking of the nucleus accumbens, it turns out that with changes, with constant stimulation, the nucleus accumbens, the neurons in that part of the brain actually change, and those changes are associated with the behavioral correlates of the loss of control that we think of as addiction. So in adults, mature prefrontal cortex seems to be able to provide some protection to the nucleus accumbens, those lower areas of the brain. But just like this building, the roof, the developing roof is not going to protect too much of what's inside in this building. Same thing in adolescence. Those developing prefrontal cortexes are not yet really fully able to protect the nucleus accumbens from developing symptoms of addiction. And so this is really where addiction takes root. And in many ways, we can think of addiction as a neurologic disorder with pediatric onset. And I'm sorry to end on such a sad note, but this is a list of all of the patients that we've cared for in ASAP who've died of overdoses in the past few years. And they want to point out that they represent a mix of patients. Some had opioid use disorders, some simply took the wrong pill at the wrong time. But this is really what, as a society, we're struggling with and hoping to prevent. And thank you. I'll stop there, and I'm happy to take questions.
So, Doctor, I have a question. I noticed 4 out of the 7 happened in September. Do you think that means something? Is it the going back to school? Is it the confronting school, that whole, I all of a sudden am ramping up again?
Well, I mean, it's a very good question. It's really interesting because we do see this pattern in the substance use clinic where the first couple of weeks of September, very slow. Hardly anybody comes in for an evaluation because people generally don't want to pull their kids out of school. But I do think that substance use is especially kids who use in response to anxiety or stress, substance use is starting to ramp up during that period. And it's very reliable that come the last week in September on the phone really starts ringing off the hook. So it takes a couple of weeks for that to kind of catch up. This is a very small sample. I don't know for sure that it's really related to going back to school, but that might have some impact. I think it's a keen observation.
And Doctor, same question. People are asking if they can have your slides.
Yeah,
They
we'll be
found
happy to
some
provide them.
Yeah. All right, Carol, you have a question?
Dr. Levy, thank you. Thank you. Many of us refer people to ASAP. I just have 2 clarifying questions. Years ago, when we started, the age was limited. I think it was like 22. And now I think you're like up to 25 and you have Suboxone and medication assisted treatment options for young people that come in and can stay. Is that correct?
We do offer Suboxone and naltrexone and other medications for substance use disorders. The question about the age, we take patients up until their 24th birthday. The reason we have a cutoff is simply because we think that for older people, there are more options, but for teens, there are actually very few. We have a waiting list right now of about 80 kids. And so, we're really trying to get to those younger kids, unless there's a particular reason. So kids who are followed in children's because they have a chronic pediatric onset condition, or, there are certain times we'll make exceptions because it makes so much sense for us to see them. But generally speaking, we prefer to get older people to other resources. And I do want to say that there is a very long waiting list, but we have a very detailed, what we call an up triage protocol, so that if you do have an adolescent who you're really worried about, whose behavior is dangerous, we can usually get them in, within a day or two, right? Because we understand the importance of getting kids who are unstable or involved in high-risk activities, at least to have that first appointment and evaluated and either stabilized on medications, or if necessary, supported in getting to a proper level of care.
Great. One more. So they come in, the reason why personally and in our community, across the communities I work with, you have the comprehensive, 3 legs of a stool: physical when they come in, psychological, right, and social emotional. So that waiting list is for the first evaluation, unless the person is very much acute. And then once they're evaluated, you kind of give the treatment plan.
Yeah, so we do an evaluation, but obviously, there's no, things that can be addressed right away are addressed right away, right? And so, kids who can benefit from medications don't have to wait to complete a full evaluation to get started on medications, right? It's, we will at some point give a comprehensive treatment plan, which could include, things like school evaluation and starting regular counseling and things like that. But, things that we can do quickly, we do.
Thank you, Dr. Levy.
I would also like to let folks know that, because the services because there is a waiting list, we also do have services that work in collaboration with primary care providers that can provide consultation and support to primary care providers in conjunction with counseling services that are run through ASAP. So for kids who really need a full, 3 legs of the stool, as you put it, an addiction medicine specialist, a substance use disorder counselor specialized, and parent support, they can come in through ASAP. For kids who may need a little bit less than that, may be able to get support through their primary care pediatrician. For example, if medications are useful, sometimes if drug testing is useful, combined with so their pediatrician can use consultation, for support to write medications or do whatever else is necessary on the medical front, and then in collaboration with a social worker through ASAP. So there's that program as well. Also has a waiting list, unfortunately, but there's some flexibility there.
So we would ask our pediatrician if they participate.
Actually, the way it works is that the pediatrician would just call the MCPAP line. If people aren't familiar, that's the Massachusetts Child Psychiatry Access Program. There's a special ASAP MCPAP line, and so the pediatrician can call ASAP MCPAP to make the referral to that program.
Thank you, I'm writing. Thank you, Dr. Levy.
Other questions? Doctor, I just wanted to ask you about the CDC's recent report on the youth risk behavior behavior survey, which talked about the sadness, the depression, the exposure to violence that had just really gone to incredibly high levels among teenage girls. anything that you saw about that report that surprised you or stood out or maybe correlated to what you're seeing in terms of the people who are coming in? You know, are you seeing an increase in girls coming? Like, what do you think that all means?
You know, it's really interesting. That girls' problems and boys' problems present differently, right? So we have more boys in the clinic than girls. And I think that's primarily because girls tend to internalize when they have problems. So girls are often quiet when they have problems and experiencing them as internal stress, whereas boys tend to externalize. So when boys have problems, like everybody knows. And so that really buys them a referral. But I think it's a good reminder to everybody that girls' problems may be less obvious. And so we need to be watching for them and screening for them and talking about them as well.
And Erin and Tanisha, like that same question, that uptick that we're seeing and the connection to substance use, like what's been your experience in terms of, are you seeing that uptick with teenage girls? Are you seeing people who are also suffering from substance use disorder or using self-medicating to respond to that in terms of girls?
I don't want to speak for Tanisha because I'm currently practicing in New York, not Massachusetts, but my organization definitely has. I tweeted out, I put that YRBS study up on my LinkedIn profile because I found it so impactful. It's a long read, but wow, there's some really interesting information in there. And we've been doing a lot more outreach to healthcare providers, particularly addictions professionals, to try and ensure that we have a strong bridge between the anti-violence work that we do and the work that they do. And the place where we're meeting, which makes me so hopeful, is racial justice. We're all sitting in the same racial justice circles. So we're defining a common language with one another. As I think Tanisha mentioned at the beginning, this BSAS effort has been 7 years in the making. I know I've cross-trained a whole bunch of addictions professionals across Massachusetts. This is the first time it really feels like we're going to be able to impact system-wide change. And it's because of the anti-oppression discussion. That's the place where I think all our value systems unite. So short answer to your question, Marion, is yes, we are seeing that uptick in both volume, but also severity of violence and abuse that people are bringing in the door and willing to disclose.
That's also a yes in Massachusetts. And to Erin's point, where I see it, we are, we're at the table talking about the racial equity pieces, because I mean, let's face it, we have all gone through these really bad times the past 3 years and we're still in it. And that has an effect. People are trying to be okay. And in that process of trying to be okay, like this is what it looks like. Folks who are shuttered in with their abusers. There's a lot of uncertainty in the time of COVID, in addition to the cultural pieces that already existed, the declaration of racism as a public health crisis. So again, culture that matters, historical context. So it's been like the perfect storm, if you will. There's been an uptick everywhere. And I don't anticipate that we're going to see a decline because these conditions still exist. And we have to eliminate the systems and institutions that create these conditions that have folks feeling like they can be abusive and then using substances to cope. So again, short answer, yes.
And a question for all three of you. I think we're seeing, and the research seems to show that there are programs in schools that can be effective in terms of identifying kids who are suffering from substance use disorder, have got other kinds of crisis issues going on. And we've got a lot of school people here today. What do you think is the most important thing that people can be doing? And how should they be thinking about, I think if you're in a big school and you've got lots of kids and you're trying to figure out how do we make sure we're reaching those kids, especially as Dr. Levy said, sometimes they're not the kids who are causing trouble or calling attention to themselves. What do you think works? What do you think people should be thinking about putting in place? One of the things we try to do here is let people leave with some concrete thoughts about what they could be doing differently or in this space?
Well, I'm happy to share my thoughts. And
Sure, of course.
so actually, I'm gonna I'd like to actually start with a word on prevention. So, I think that when we're talking about kids, really all the action is in prevention, and the more primary prevention we can do, the better. So I would like to talk about something really positive. So a number of years ago, Massachusetts passed a law that said that all schools have to offer what we call screening and brief intervention twice, right? Once in middle school and once in high school. And the idea was you'd screen kids, you'd pick up the kids who have bigger problems on screening and try and connect them to some services, and everybody else would get some sort of education to help them either, delay onset, or if they've, quit if they've already started, or at least reduce use. And it's a really, it's a program, it's interesting because, it takes a lot of effort on the school's part, because each kid meets with a teacher or a counselor or, somebody on the staff individually for like a one-on-one session to complete a screen and then to get some education. And, we've spoken to staff. I know that it's a heavy lift for schools. I would like to say that our team conducted an experimental evaluation of the program, and we found that, in fact, that kids who that when kids receive the screening and brief intervention, well, let me start by saying that, the typical trajectory of substance use that we see during middle and high school years is once substance use is initiated, it tends to get heavier, more frequent, and more intense with more substances as time goes on. That's always been true. What we saw in the kids who got the SBIRT is that they had less increase in intensity compared to kids who didn't get the SBIRT. So in other words, we saw, between the two groups, we saw reductions in use. So, instead of this constantly escalating trajectory, the SBIRT program seemed to bend the trajectories, not so much for alcohol, at least not in our findings, but for cannabis and for nicotine, for nicotine vaping. And, it suggested to me that the alcohol use, by the time somebody's in 7th or 8th grade, their ideas, their thoughts, and their opinions about alcohol are fairly set in stone. So this 1-minute intervention doesn't do a whole lot to change them. But kids are still questioning when it comes to vaping, when it comes to nicotine, when it comes to cannabis. There's still room there. And so we saw this deflection in their trajectories. I see that as very positive. Those results were published in a journal called JAMA Network Open. They were published at the last August. And I think that they're really important findings because I think Massachusetts was very bold in putting forward this law. And now we have some evidence that, yes, we're asking a lot of effort, but we're really doing something very good with this effort. So I don't think that answered your question exactly, but I think it's important to call out.
That's interesting though. Erin, did you want to say something?
Again, since I'm in New York, I'm happy to, but Tanisha, did you have thoughts here? Want to foreground the Massachusetts folks?
Yeah. What I imagine, my experience, I'm in Springfield, and what the school systems look like are different than other parts of the state. I would say talk to young people, give them environments where they can feel safe to disclose the reality of their lives and existence. Again, throwing in that cultural context, it's like, I'm not going to say something about what's happening because I was raised like, you don't talk about what's going on in my house, like that experience. And then also, if I say these things, what are the consequences going to be, which oftentimes look like something punitive, right? So folks need help. It's not accessible because it comes with all of these other things that the folks who are trying to help aren't necessarily thinking about. So it's like, okay, well, this child has disclosed this thing to me. I'm a mandated reporter. Here comes the 51A, here comes DCF, and this has blown up the life of this child in this way. Like, was that the best thing that needed to happen? Which is why the Black and brown kids are like, no, we're fine, but they're really not fine. And you're seeing, higher substance abuse rates, because what are my other options? And I think that that's something that we need to insert into this space for what it is, because it does replicate all of these systems and institutions of dominance and blowing up people's lives. I mean, I would say that it is violence to call DCF on Black folks, like what it actually does. But how do we get help to the folks who are impacted in these ways? And it's going to look different, the students sitting in one of the high schools here in Springfield, as opposed to someone sitting out in Boston in their school, because what are the resources that are available and the methods that folks want to employ to help people, right? Who's sitting in the principal's office for whatever thing that has happened, right? Who's getting suspended, who's getting sent to the guidance counselor's office instead, or you need to talk to the social worker, let's go to the nurse. I don't even know if that's a thing still. Like, is that money is it in the budget? Like, this is how far removed I am from these spaces, and knowing we don't have adequate resources to help folks where they're at without it being punitive. So that's what I think is happening out there in terms of how do we help more students, and again, have the shift and a decrease in substance use and abuse.
I really appreciate both of those points as someone who runs a luxuriously large primary prevention wing. Dr. Levy, you make my heart sing. Yes, yes, primary prevention. And I want to encourage us all to be at the table. When I was at Newton Wellesley, it was a point of pain for me. We had an extraordinary child psych program. We had extraordinary addictions medicine wing. And we were often like sliding past one another and cheering on each other's work, but never all in the same place, because the structure of healthcare currently insurance driven doesn't allow for that kind of public health effort where we can all be at the table all at the same time. And particularly for healthcare providers, what Tanisha and I do is less fee for service. I'm really mindful that what many healthcare based providers their time is precious. And so being able to have those public health conversations, being able to leave their institution and go out into community and work with all the rest of us, we need to figure out a different, much like the statewide child psychiatry response, we need to figure out different funding streams to support people like Tanisha and Dr. Levy to be at the table and not be working 18 hours a day. Because to your point, Tanisha, there's not enough resources, and we could save money if we invested in primary prevention earlier on in life on all these fronts, on violence, on substance use, on mental health. We all know that as people age, those things too often collide. So yeah, I want to cheer the primary prevention efforts and a plea for all of us to think about what are the levers we need to push to change the funding streams.
I'd even add to that with the changing the funding streams, because I have to navigate in a lot of these spaces around housing, homelessness, addiction, like all of it. And there's not enough funding for bad policy. We cannot fund our ways out of bad policy and laws and everything else. And I'm sitting having to, have conversations like, listen, the bucket, it doesn't even have a hole in the bottom. It doesn't have a bottom. So a lot of these conversations also need to look like we need a bucket, a new bucket that actually has a bottom, so that when we put resources in it, it's actually doing something. Right now, we're trying to put Band-Aids on a carotid artery that has blown out. That's not going to do it. So I want that to be part of the conversation too, because again, like it's bad policy, right? That's why we spend more time being reactive instead of proactive. We can solve these things, right? And put the resources where they need to, if that's what we really want to do. And I think we need to ask that question too, like in these spaces in our spheres of influence, like, do we really want to change this? Or do we want to fund the hamster in the wheel stuff that we've been doing generation after generation?
Carol, did you have a question?
I just had a comment. I'm on the Medfield Board of Health for many years, and I just wanted to say there's an amazing opportunity for funding with the opioid litigation grant money that's coming to all our communities. And in fact, Deirdre Calvert and the state subdivision agreement state that families and people that have been impacted should be at the table in talking about how this money has been spent. And through DPH, we are twice a month have updates as across the Commonwealth Boards of Health and Public Health staff on the TA that BSAS will provide, and the opportunities to become knowledgeable about this money that's been starting to come into our general fund in our municipalities. And also as an advocate, as a parent and a Board of Health member, to work to advocate to allocate more money of that to primary prevention, and be able to not only work on harm reduction and supporting people in our communities through the structures they've outlined, but becoming knowledgeable and be advocates, because work like Dr. Levy and Erin and Tanisha is talking about, there's money now, and most of our communities are finding out there's a lot of money, and it's going to be for many years. So just a
Thank you.
FYI.
Thank you. Doctor, there's a question in the chat for you about whether ASAP provides Narcan for families to take home.
We prescribe Narcan to, when appropriate, but to many of the families who are coming through, and talk to them about how to use it. Our program has become largely virtual by that happened over the pandemic, and while we work in a hybrid model and still offer in-person visits, most patients prefer to be seen virtually. So so we don't have a lot of we do have fentanyl test strips for folks who come in, but we don't actually have Narcan on site.
Thank you. Thank you. All right. Any last questions, comments? No? I want to thank our three presenters today. I think you've given us sort of a whole different view of some of these issues, and also some great resources for people that we may encounter in our work. So thank you all for being here. Thank you. And I have a list, a big list today of things that people want me to tell you about. Beginning on Wednesday, March 22nd, from 6 to 7:15 by Zoom, there'll be a community information session and a presentation of Elliott's new Community Behavioral Health Center. And that is targeted particularly for community members in Melrose, Wakefield, and Stoneham. And the plan is that this will expand local access to routine, urgent, and crisis treatment for mental health services. The presentation will cover the services that are being provided, local and community information, and referral information, as well as how to access services. So we'll put the link to register for that in the chat. On Monday, March 27th, from 7 to 8:30 p.m., NAMI Central Middlesex will host a webinar panel discussion for students, parents, and school counselors on college and mental health, with topics covering mental health friendly signs for mental health friendly colleges, signs to look for when applying to college, family communication plans, communicating with the disability office, and campus supports. So the webinar will not be recorded, so tune in if you're able to attend. And we'll put that link in the chat as well. A event will be at on Wednesday, March 29th, the Newton Wellesley Hospital Community Collaborative will host its second annual summit, bringing together members and leadership of the 8 councils within the collaborative. So we'll be there for that. And I also want to take a minute to acknowledge the work of our colleagues in Chelmsford, Taryn Angel and Darcy Beal. They've been averaging 2 Narcan trainings a month with about 20 people at each of those. So they're training about 40 people a month in the use of Narcan. And we've been delivering Narcan to them to use I invite you again, reach out to us, text or email Madeline Guerin, who's on this call. If you need Narcan, we've just bought more. So, you know, my goal is to get it off the shelves and into the hands of people who need it. Our next meeting will be Wednesday, April 12th from 10 to 11:30. And we'll send that link. We're also going to be sure that we're mixing up our meetings in May and June. So for people that Wednesday mornings are difficult for, we'll have some other options. So again, thank you all for being here. I am grateful to our speakers and grateful to all of you for partnering with us in this work. So stay safe, enjoy the sun that seems to be coming out today after the blizzard. So thank you, take care, bye-bye.